Welcome. Thank you guys so much for joining us
Great.
here in class today. We have this console. Does anyone want to try using it and see if they can figure it out? Paige, I don't think you've had a chance, so do you want to give it a go?
I'd love to. So maybe it's 5, 2, 2, 4. No.
Would you like
All
a
right.
hint?
Sure.
Well, there's nothing inside of here, but perhaps if we go around to the back, we might find a hint.
Working codes. 1, 2, 3. 2, 3, 4. 3, 4, 5. Oh my God. Such obviously good ones.
Woo!
Let's go back and try one. 2, 3, 4.
There you go. What's happening inside the
And now it
locker?
must out. Oh, there's my prize! Fantastic!
It's smart that
That's
you
so
use a
excellent.
pointer
This
because
works.
that's one of
yeah.
the problems is hitting triggers.
Correct. Fingers just weren't
You
working.
go to
I
hit a
tried
trigger and
a lot of
yeah.
different tricks and it wasn't
Yeah.
working. You'll notice that the code can go up to 6 digits. So we have the largest code is 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0 pound. There we go. So that is the longest code you can make. And every time you
Nice.
click on it, it shows your user ID. And when you let go, it goes back to default. So if someone else wants to try grabbing it, you'll see that it's going to switch to Dan's username.
Right.
So that's pretty cool too. And this is going to be really high level. So if you want to just always come back to this world whenever you want to copy, or if you want to duplicate it, feel free to. I'm not offended at all. But I'd like to go and show you exactly how we did this. And then we're going to go and take it a step further
do it.
and see how we can make it so that these are persistent across sessions. So when a player comes back, it remembers they've typed in a code. So we're going to go into that today. We're going to build that one from scratch. But let's first start by showing you how this all works. Here is our little safe sort of locker. And you'll notice there's a trigger. On our trigger, we have a door trigger script running. So then inside the door trigger, at the beginning of the world, we want to set our rotation. So we know where does the door's rotation start. And then we set that to be the rotation of the door. And so we have to tag the object door, which you'll notice is this object in here. And then that door object has an invisible counterpart which allows it to swivel on this axis. And so that's how we get that smooth opening without having to make some extensive code. So then from in here, we can see that when the trigger is entered by a player, we cancel sending event close door because you'll see in a moment why that's important. But then we rotate to the start rotation plus how much we're rotating by. And so if you go to the variables tab, you'll notice we have a variable called rotate by. And this rotate by allows us to set any amount. So technically you could rotate this door on a different axis. You could rotate it a certain degrees that you want it to open. If you only wanted to open a crack, you could do that as well. So we rotate by over the rotate time. So we've set rotate time to be 4 seconds. When the trigger is exited by the player, we send an event called close wait. And we use the time to close seconds. So it's going to take 3 seconds before the door closes. And then we send that to self. And then when close wait is received, we rotate to that original start rotation that we set when world is started over the rotate time on the door. So this allows it to go back to its original position. But remember, we have this cancel sending event close wait. The reason we're doing that is because if we didn't cancel sending it when the trigger was entered, the door would automatically close even if you were inside of it and you wouldn't be able to get out. Let's start by looking at the wand because it's pretty simple. So this is our wand script right here. We have our wand object over here. And this wand object is 2 objects. We have a long black stick and a white top. So the white top is an object that's just a sphere. It's been tagged C. The C tag allows it, we're calling that like a cursor. And then each of these triggers along the top of these numbers and letters is tagged on objects tagged C. So whenever this top of the stick hits the trigger, it then sends an event to the trigger object. So we'll go to that in a minute, but first we're looking at the wand. And so what we can see is we have the wand, and the wand has a few variables like rotation, position, and we also tag the wand into the control object. Our control object is this small green trigger over here. So this is where we run all of our like kind of brain operations from. When the world is started, we start by setting the position and the rotation. So it's very similar to the door in that we needed to set the rotation to remember where it was at, but we also set the position of the wand. And this is so when the person stops holding on to the object or the wand, it always returns back here. So if some, player walked in and threw it off the edge, it'll still come back. So that's kind of important.
Mm-hmm.
And then when the player grabs the wand, we then cancel sending my event for the same reason we did with the door. And then we send event player ID to the controller with the player. So we bring this player down by using the duplicate tool. And so that way we're sending the parameter player, so our control object knows which player just grabbed the wand. And so that's how we set our player ID inside of the terminal. And then when the grab ends with players received, we send my event to self. So what my event is the return object. So when my event is received after 5 seconds of not holding on to the wand, it's going to move back to its original position in rotation. But if you pick it up within 5 seconds of letting go, you can still continue holding on to it. So then, in addition to that, we also clear the ID. So we send the event clear ID to control. So that way, when the player lets go of the wand, it clears their ID out of the system.
Quick question. I see send event clear ID, but I don't see receive when event clear ID is received.
Great question. So we're sending it to the control object. So under our variables, you'll note that we've created an object labeled control. And then on our wand, we have tagged it into the control trigger over here. And by doing that, we can send events from the wand to the trigger. And so let's go ahead and hop on over to our control script and take a look at what that looks like. So looking at our control script, there's a lot here. So we're going to just take this in pieces. Let's start by understanding what did the wand just do. So let's start by scrolling down. And as you scroll down, you will find player ID, so PLID, and you'll also see clear ID right below it. For player ID, when we receive player ID, we're receiving it with a parameter. So that's that plus button. If you press the plus button, you can then create a parameter. And so then I clicked on the player because it was a player ID, and then I typed in PLID. So that way I know that it's a player ID that's being received. And so then we display text, the name of the player ID. So we use the name, and then we drag the player ID variable that we just received down into here, and then we set that on a variable object text. So that's how we can display it on our terminal. And then immediately afterward, we set player in motion to player ID. We haven't used the player in motion, but basically what this is going to tell our control object is, hey, this is who's logged into the terminal. So when you need it, you have that information available. Now immediately underneath that, we have clear ID. When clear ID is received, we set player in motion to empty. So I created a player variable, but we're never going to set it. So player in motion is a player variable that we set, but empty is a player variable that we don't set. So that way when we set player in motion to empty, we know there's nothing happening there, and then we display text UserID. So we just do the exact same display text, but instead we use a string, so just a plain old text string. We write in UserID, and that's on the UserID text, which is right over there. Let's next take a look at our trigger. So the trigger runs on each one of these numbers. So here's our trigger. And so we're going to notice that this is enabled, so it's on. We'll also notice that the trigger is working on objects tagged, and we have tagged the object C. So remember, the top of the wand is an object that has been tagged C inside of the grouping. And then we have attached the script number trigger. Inside of number trigger, we have a variable that we set for each one of these triggers, which is what am I? So I am number 1. So number 2 is number 2, number 3 is number 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 0, all as you'd expect. But C, the clear icon, that one is 10. And the hashtag, that is 11. 10 is for clearing, 11 is for submitting your enter. So you could use something else like an arrow key or another symbol if you didn't want it to look like a hashtag. We make sure to tag our control object. So you'll see that we tag our control. We also tag the sound effect click sound effect, and scale is no longer used. When event trigger exits with object. So we could have used when trigger enters, but I decided to use exit because it's kind of like when you press down on a button, it doesn't submit it until you release. And then we're going to do the cancel sending event my event for the same reason we did before, but I'll explain it again in just a second. And then we send my event to self after 0.2 seconds. When my event is received, we move the sound effect to the position of the trigger. So wherever that trigger is placed, it's going to move there. and then it's going to play the clicking sound. It will then send event data in to our controller with I am. So remember, on every single one of these, we set I am to be 0 through 11. And so that variable gets sent through to our control object, which is then we'll be able to know what was pressed on the keyboard. Why are we canceling sending my event? It doesn't seem to make sense. Well, what can happen is if a player is trying to pull their wand out, within those 0.2 seconds, you might receive multiple my events. So what this does is it prohibits multiple events from happening and only sends one event through per instance. Let's head back up to control and let's see what happens when data comes into our controller. I want to start by starting on a higher level for our controller, because as soon as data comes in, we go through the entire process. So go to our variables tab. Our data point in motion is what was the data that we received. So whatever number comes in, whether it's 0 through 11, that's what this is going to be. We're going to set this and then use it for a little bit until the next one gets set. UserID text is an object variable, so we tag the object UserID, and that's the text object. We also tag the code text object. We then have the player in motion. This is a player variable that we utilize to know which player is accessing the terminal. We have code in motion. So this is the code that's happening behind the scenes. So if someone types in 9, this becomes 9. If someone types in another 9, it becomes 99, and so on. This empty, that is our empty player variable. So it's a player variable that will always leave empty, so we can always set our player in motion to empty. Our codes, so we have code 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So this allows you to set the codes from inside of your control object. So you can set these to be any number, and those are the numbers that are being checked for. Please note that the correlation between code 1 and item 1 is the similar for 2 and 3 and so on. So then we have objects tagged item 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And so these are the 5 cubes that will spawn inside of the locker. And then we have correct sound effect. This is the sound that plays when you get it correct. And down here on our control trigger, you'll notice that there are 5 doohickeys. And we can use these 5 references to tag our objects. And once we've done that, that is how it'll work. Maybe take a step back before we go into data entry, and let's understand what is happening with those objects. Because you've brought up a good point. Why are the objects tagged? How are they all working? So if we go to the object script at the top, similar to all of our settings, we're setting position and rotation at the very beginning of the world. So that way we remember where it was that we want these objects to be. And then we send event hide to self after 1 second. So 1 second into the world, these objects go into hiding. And then we come down here to when event hide is received, and we move to position to hide on self. And so each object could have its own position to hide, because if you go over to variables, you'll see that there's a vector, which is where do you want this to hide. Now, you could have made this a trigger, but to keep it lightweight, you have to type in a number. I never build it 0, 0, 0, so I'm going to leave this at 0, 0, 0, because that's where those objects are going to run off to for me. All of our objects are going to run off to 0, 0, 0. And when we receive the activate command, which is going to come from our control object, so once that code has been entered correctly, we receive activate from the control object. Then we move to the original position and the original rotation. And then when the player picks it up, we're going to cancel sending event hide. But then when they let go, we're going to send event hide to self. So remember, hide is that first script we use at the beginning to move to 0, 0, 0. And then we send that after how many seconds? And so we've set a variable to hide it after 10 seconds. You could set that to be anything. But after a player is done using one of these objects, theoretically, they shouldn't be using it anymore unless, depending on your game, you could maybe never hide it. But since this is designed to be a multiplayer world, we'd want anyone to be able to access this object. And so when grab ends with player, we then send hide. But if they pick it up within 10 seconds, we cancel sending hide until they let go again. Let's start by scrolling down to data in. So remember, when the wand hits the trigger above the number, we get data entry. So this is our data in. When event data in with data point is received. So remember, we sent the data event from the object, we sent I am. So whatever I am was, whether it was a 0 through 11, we sent that as this data point. So this is a number being received with the label data point. We then are going to cancel sending event data point check for the same reason we did inside of the event itself. Because if someone takes their wand really quickly and just smashes it across the screen, we're going to only accept one of those for every 1/5 of a second. So this prevents there from being multiple entries. It does mean that if you were really fast hitting it, you might be missing a couple numbers, but I think the accuracy is actually far greater in this setup than in others. So that's why we have cancel sending event. And then we set data point in motion to data point. So data point in motion is just a number variable that we'll be using throughout our script, because data point, when it's sent through this event, this data point is only available inside the event. But by setting it as a number, we can use it anywhere inside of our script. We have send event data point check to self after 0.2 seconds. So now we're going to scroll up, and when we get to the top, you're going to see data point check. And under data point check, we're going to see 3 if statements. These 3 if statements are basically checking to see whether it's a number variable, whether it's a clear, or whether it's a hashtag to submit. So if it's a number, which means it's a 10 or less than a 10, so 9, 8, 7, 6 through 0, then we set code in motion to be code in motion times 10. So our initial number, let's say we typed in a 9. When you type in another 9, to get it to be 9, we have to multiply it by 10 because that moves it over 1 digit. So then we get 90, and then we add in the current data point. And so that gives us 99. And then we can continue doing that indefinitely. So you can just continue adding additional data points. I have noted that the terminal does max out after about 7 or 8 data points. So don't go any higher than that. You'll start seeing a bunch of zeros and the numbers stop coming in correctly. So just kind of keep that in mind. If the data point is a 10, which means it was the clear, so if they press on the C, we get a 10 received, and then we set code in motion to number 0. So that just resets the number back to 0. And then if data point in motion is an 11, this is when we send event reset code to self. So we're going to reset the code back to 0. And then we're also going to check the code. So if someone presses the pound sign, then we're going to go ahead and reset it. And you'll notice that resetting the code happens after 1 second, but checking the code happens after 1/10 of a second. You have to check the code before you reset the code. If you reset the code before you've checked the code will be 0 and it won't work. I found that out the hard way. All right, let's go first look at the reset code. So right immediately here underneath, you'll see reset code is just setting code in motion to 0 again and sending event update text to self. So we have the update text event. Just scroll down just a hair and you'll see the update text is just displaying string code plus code in motion displayed as a string. At the very bottom, you see where it says send event update text to self after 0.1 seconds. Everybody sees that? Okay. So we send it after 0.1 seconds because if we don't add a slight delay, these data points aren't set before displaying. So by adding this slight 0.1 second delay, we now get the correct number displayed. But by separating the event into its own event update text, we can now use it as many times as we want. So we can now send event update text after resetting the code. And so we can utilize it multiple times whenever we need to update the text rather than having to type in the text, show display text on object. So now when we come down here to when event update text is received, you're going to notice that it says display with, and we're going to start by displaying this on the code text object. So that's our variable is on code text object. And we first start by grabbing a plus symbol. Once you've grabbed a plus symbol, we need to grab a string. The string, we can type in as much text as we want here. So I've put in code : space bar. By typing in 1 space, we separate the number from being directly next to it. And then code in motion is a number variable. So it's a number, not a text object. So what we need to do is convert it to string. And string is going to take it as a number and convert it into text, which is still a number, but it's usable. If you go to your operations tab and you scroll all the way to the bottom, you'll find variable as string. And that's how we can convert any variable into a string. So far, so good. Any questions about this point before we start checking codes?
Absorbing as much as I can.
And no worries, you can always come back here if you want to take a look later. And for those watching, you are welcome to get a copy of this. Just message me and we'd be happy to give you access to this code as well. So you can either take a look or just copy it blatantly. That's fine by me. So Let's go ahead and continue scrolling down, because remember up here when we did the hashtag symbol or the pound symbol, when we sent that through, we sent the event reset, or excuse me, check code. When we sent check code through, we did check the code. So if we scroll down to the check code event, it's a pretty long event, so just get to the top part of it. When event check code is received. So we're going to run 5 if statements. This is for each of the different variables. You could have more than 5 objects. You could have more than 5 codes. And so every time you add an if statement, this is a code that you're checking. And so more or less, these are all duplicates of the exact same code just for each object. So our first if statement is if code1 equals our code in motion. So if they've typed in the correct code that we set as a number variable over there, then we're going to play the sound, correct sound effects, and we're going to send event activate to item number 1. So remember, when we were in the object script, for the objects, we had set up an event called activate. By sending this event to the item, we then move it back to its original position. And so we can do that for all of our 5 objects. And I'm just going to verify that that's all that we have in here, because I think that is. Yep. So that's all 5 objects are literally just that same code. So it's if code equals the code in motion, whatever the current code is, play the sound and send activate to that item. So that is how you make this setup work. But what if we want to take this a step further? What if we want to have the player be able to come back and remember like what items they had unlocked? Well, we're going to have to use our persistent variables. But there's 5 objects here, and there's only 5 persistent variables. So that means, do you have to use one for each of these? The answer is no. We can have more than 5 objects inside of a persistent variable. So let's go ahead and open up your build box. So when you go to the build settings, you're with all your objects inside of it, or in build mode, and you're going to see there's a settings icon. And if you go down to settings, and then we go down to player variables, go ahead and click a new, and I'm going to name this one objects. And in fact, I'm going to name it objects unlocked. Okay. And then I'm going to save it. What is it we're about to do? First of all, you see this number? This is my player persistent variable. These 5 digits we're using as booleans of 0 and 1, 0 and 1. Is this object unlocked? Is this object unlocked? Each of these represents an object. And so if I come over here to our console and I type in 1, 2, 3 pound, I've unlocked a new one. And if I come in here and reload this number, you'll see that object 1 has now been unlocked. If I come in here and type in, say 4, 5, 6 pound, we're now going to unlock object number 4. So now the 4th one has been unlocked. And when we come in here, we'll see here are the objects. And most importantly, when I get rid of the objects, so now when I've gotten rid of these objects, when I open the door, there's a trigger right here that checks and brings these objects back in when I come and reopen this, because it's checking my player variable. So this is really powerful, and it's pretty incredible, really. But let's go take a look and see how we did it. So the first thing we want to note is that this is just like pasting what is the player persistent variable, just kind of so you can visually see what it is. So you don't need to worry about that. But here is our control. We've built a separate control object, so that way the controller for the display is separate than the controller for the player's persistent variable. Let's look at this in chronological order. When the player enters the world, the first thing we're going to do is set the player ID variable to that of the player. Then, if the user's persistent variable is less than 100,000, in other words, it has not been set or changed, then we're going to set their persistent variable to 100,000. I recognize that it shows 1,000 here, but the extra zeros are just kind of hidden. And we do that for their player ID. So this is a set, and you can find these persistent variables right here. So you can set persistent variable, and you can get player persistent variable right here. Then we send event initiate to self after 0.1 seconds. When initiate is received, we're going to go ahead and send event clear booleans to self. So this is an event where we clear the booleans out, so we make them reset. Then we set the player var to get the persistent variable of objects unlocked for the player. So now we know what it is, and we can change this as we need to. And then we send event check object status to self after 0.2 seconds. These delays just kind of keep our thing flowing smoothly and in order. Now under check object status, we're going to set the player var to be player var minus 100,000. So it's important to note that by putting 100,000 here, this is just a visual representation for myself. It's not required. But by putting 100,000 there, we basically say, okay, this first number represents kind of like our definition of when a player has been on. So there might be other reasons to know whether or not a player has been on in the world or not. So that kind of sixth variable, that sixth boolean, is just more or less saying player has joined world before, but you don't technically need it there. What we're doing first is we're subtracting that 100,000 because we've set it at the beginning. We know that it's there no matter what. So we just go ahead and remove 100,000 from the player var, not from their actual persistent variable, just from the one that we're using locally inside of this script. So we subtract that from their player var and then reset the player var to the new number, which gives us just the remaining 5 digits. We then send event v5 to self after 0.1 seconds. Now, when event v5 is received, we're going to set var in motion. And so this is a separate variable from the player var to be the floor of player var divided by 10,000. There is a 0 missing here, I apologize. So when we divide the player var by 10,000, if they have a number, say the 5th digit is a 1, then this is going to come back as a 1, because what floor does is it says, I just want whole numbers. And so I'm going to go to the bottommost whole number. So if it's 1.001, just like they've unlocked 2 objects, so they've unlocked the first object, which is the number 1, then they have 2 zeros, 0, 0, and then actually there would actually be another 0, and then 1, so it's 10,000, so it's 10,001. Well, we'd have 1.0001. Well, we don't want that decimal, we just want a whole number, and so that's what floor does. It gives us a whole number at the lowest value. And so by taking player var divided by 10,000, if they've unlocked it, we'll get 1, and if they have not unlocked it, we'll get 0. We then send two events. We send event v4 and v42. And we send these in order, so 0.1 seconds and 0.2 seconds. When event v4 is received, if the var in motion, so we just set this to be 1 or 0, so if it equals 1, meaning we know the object is activated, we then set, this is our object 5 boolean, to be true, which means we know that object is unlocked. We then set the player var to player var minus 10,000. So now that we're done, and we know that they have 10,000. We know that that 5th digit is a 1. We need to subtract that digit, so we minus 10,000. And then when v42 is received, we're going to set that var in motion using the same code above to floor of player var divided by 1,000. And now you can see the decimal place. Yay, there's a period to represent that it's 1,000. Love it. So anyway, now we're on the fourth digit, and we're going to check and see if that is 0 or 1. And we're going to do the exact same thing several times. So then we're going to send event v3 and v3.2 with the same 1 and 0.2 delays. If var in motion equals 1, then we go ahead and set the boolean to true, so we know the object is activated. We set the player var subtract 1,000. And keep in mind, we don't need to do any subtraction if it's a 0 there. So if the person, say, had object 5 and 1 unlocked, that's 10,001. But if they only had object 4 and 1 unlocked, that's 4,001. So we didn't need to subtract the 10,000. Or in the same case here, say they only had object 3 and 1 unlocked, that would be 101. Then we don't need to subtract 1,000. Hence, this is running inside of this if statement. So now that we subtracted 1,000, we've set the boolean to be true, so we know the object is active. We can then run event v32. When we set var in motion to floor again, we divide by 100 this time. It's doing the exact same thing as before, just with the next digit over. We then send event v2 and v22, and we check to see if it's 1, set the object true or false, set the player var, and we subtract 100 again. And then when v22 is received, we're going to see the exact same thing, set var in motion to the floor, a player var divided by 10, so now we've gone down 1 more digit. We send event 1 and 1, 2. When event 1 is received, if var in motion is 1, we set the object 2 to be true, and we set player var to be subtract 10. And you'll notice on this v12, we're doing something slightly different than what we saw up here. Up here, we sent 2 events. This case, we finally made it to the bottom. We no longer need to worry about dividing. Since we subtracted 10, we're on the last digit, so it's just set var in motion to be the player var. We don't need to worry about subtracting, don't need to worry about dividing, getting a floor. Super easy for v0. If var in motion equals 1, set object unlocked to be true, send event activate object. So we've made it to the end, and no matter what, we're going to cycle through every single one of these events no matter what. So when we get to the end of this loop, or this array, if you will, we send event activate object to self after 0.3 seconds. And I've sent this with a slight longer delay just because I was like, maybe this should be in order just in case it's not. You might be able to, quick make this faster by making it 0.1 seconds, but I just play on the edge of caution. When event activate object is then received, if the Boolean object 1 unlocked, object 2 unlocked, object 3 unlocked, object 4 unlocked, object 5 unlocked, remember that's what we were setting up there to be Boolean true when we had it as a 1, and we didn't set it if it was a 0. So if it equals true now, we then send event activate to the object. So you'll remember in our original script, we sent activate to bring the object into the locker. And so we can do the exact same thing here, sending activate codes to the object. And so now we've got these 5 objects can be activated via the booleans that we set above. So remember at the very beginning we sent clear booleans, and when we cleared booleans, that was in the initiate event. We just set these to be false because after one person has done it or one person has entered, it remains true for those objects. So we need to set them as false at the very beginning of the script every time it's run. Taking a quick look at our variables in here. So when we look at our variables, we've kind of gone through them already, but we have 5 booleans. This is object 1 unlocked through 5. We then have 5 objects representing our 5 cubes in the locker. We then have the player var, which is a number that's in motion. We have the player ID, which is a player ID that's in motion. We have a var in motion, which is another variable that's just a number in motion. We have which object right now is another number variable that's in motion, which defines which object was just received, so which object had just been activated at the terminal. And we have a leftover text object, which is not required. You'll remember in our control script, that's where we're at right now, we send event check code. When check code is sent, we're sending the event player update to the object control with player in motion. This is going to first send the player ID. So remember how earlier I was talking about how this knowing who is logged into the terminal was important? This is why it's important. It's so that we can tell other objects who it was. So now we send this through as player update. So we send that over to our control object. And then after we've done that, when the code is correct, we send another event we called myEvent to our control object with the number 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, representing which code was unlocked, for which object was unlocked. This tells us which number we need to adjust. So that's how we get those two codes over and into here. So if we come back to our object control and we scroll down here to the bottom, when event player update is received with the player ID, we set the player ID to PLID. So we drag this down, and now we know which player is logged into the terminal and who we need to be updating for. Then we're going to receive that myEvent. And when myEvent is received, we know which object was unlocked. So we set which object right now, so this is our object in motion, to which object, so now we know it's either 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. We then send event initiate to self. Remember the initiate code at the beginning? So we normally do that when player enters, but we can also do that when the player has accessed a code. We also then send event add to player var. So I'm not going to go through the whole initiate because you just saw that, but initiate is basically going to go ahead and start the whole process of figuring out which codes have already been unlocked. And so you'll notice that add to player var happens after 2 seconds. This is important because we need to find out which objects have already been unlocked. And so those booleans that we used earlier are also very important for adding to the player's variable. So when we come down here, we check if the object is 1, if the object is 2, 3, 4, or 5. We also have to make sure that this if statement is only running when it's object 1 and object 1 is not unlocked. So if we run through the player's variable and they have a 1 there It doesn't matter that they've typed the code in again. We cannot increase that over a 1. So we say, okay, if you've already unlocked it, we're not going to run this. But if you have not unlocked it and it's false, it's not unlocked, then we set objects unlocked, that's the player's persistent variable, to get the user's persistent variable. So we get their current value and we add 1 to it because this is for object 1. So we know that's a 1 value and that's for the player ID for that player. And we also use the player ID there as well. And we do that for every single object, just with the respective number. So 1, 10, 100, 1000, and 10,000. And then we're done, because now that we've set the player's persistent variable, when they come back into the world, we know remember we're running that script as soon as they enter. But you might be thinking, well, that's great, but what if I want to use that later on? Like when you entered the trigger earlier, it brought the objects back. Well, you're absolutely right. So when we go into our door trigger, we'll notice that when trigger is entered with player, we are also sending player update to the object control. And we're sending event initiate to object control, but we're delaying it by just a little bit to make sure they come in order. Now, theoretically, my understanding is these two things will always come in order when you send them to the event. So this delay might not be necessary and could probably be even minimized less. But I love having a delay just so I feel confident and no worries. But I know it's not the most effective or the fastest method. So if you want to, you can try playing around with getting that down to like 0.1 seconds or even completely removing it and just see if it works. So that's it. I mean, it doesn't get like any simpler than that. I really do want to just show you one last quick thing here, which is the control object, which is this one here. And so as you'll see, we've linked in all 5 objects. We can see the booleans in here. We can see that there's these other variables that are used in motion. And it's more or less just dragging these and connecting them. Sometimes in a script, you're going to have more variables than you have objects that you need to link. So you want to make sure you put in the objects to link first. So if you put them in first, they're always going to be on this display. If you put them in last, they're not always on this display. I think it should be the opposite, just for anybody who's listening, because sometimes you add objects or just make a scroll bar, please. One or the other. Anyway, I hope this helps. I am so excited to have hub worlds like this. And there's so many possibilities with just this simple idea. And so if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. But I look forward to seeing what you guys create. I'll see you in the next one. Bye! 1, 2, 3. Oh, nope, still says 100,000. Oh, there it is. We've unlocked number 1. So if we come over here, oh, I'm so excited. It works. Okay, we go 4, 5, 6, and pound. And wait a second, and then come through. Yeah! Oh, this is so good. Oh, this is so good. Look at that. Look at that, Dan. We've got working code. Open the door.
I'm glad I could help.
Your emotional support was very needed. Thank you. I would have given up a while ago. So you can see yours is at 100,000. And if you want to go type in a code, it will increment it. And before you do, though, I should see... Oh! Was that you or me? That was me. That was me.
That's you.
So it works. It brings back the objects.
Which one am I grabbing? Red?
Yeah, I think
that was me, right?
You typed in
Red?
1, right?
1, 2, 3, yeah.
Perfect. Okay. So if you walk into that, walk into the code there, it should say 10001.
Okay.
Ah, look at that. Some beautiful binary. Oh, nothing like some beautiful binary. Do you have any questions, Dan?
I am just impressed with your whole thought process. This is like, I was drowning here, but I tried to hang in there to
You made it to the end, and
see it through.
I think if you come back, with a fresh brain, I definitely was about to poop out myself, but if you come back and watch the video, have a second take on it, you're going to see that it's pretty simple code,
Right.
and it's more just about first understand how it works in general, and then when you come back again, then it's just implementing and it's kind of just repetition, unfortunately, for each object.
Right.
So if you only need 3 objects, only
Well,
do 3. Thank you, Dan, for sticking it out till the end, and everyone else who made it here to the end. Really appreciate you coming to watch. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask, and we look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye.